Hello, Latin 1. Welcome to Chapter 1 of Verbs, First and Second Conjugations, Adverbs, Reading, and Translating Latin. I'm going to be using videos like this to help you to get the information in the book, and you will hopefully let me know how they work for you moving forward. So, we'll start with our discussion of verbs. Verbs describe, of course, a subject's activity or its state of being. An action verb is typically something like jumps or runs or reads or sleeps, while a state of being verb is usually what we call a linking verb, and is the most common of which is, of course, is or are, was, were, those types of verbs. Those are also verbs, and they are called state of being or linking verbs, and we'll talk more about those later. Every verb in Latin has 5 characteristics. Those characteristics are, as you see on the screen here, person, number, tense, mood, and voice. Most of these characteristics will not actually be discussing this year. I shouldn't say most. Mood and voice we will not be discussing this year, but person, number, and tense are all characteristics of the verb that we will be using in the course of our first year of study. Person of a verb refers to the person who is performing the verb, the action of the verb. It's always taken from the perspective of the person who's doing the speaking. So the first person would be either the speaker or a group of people, including the speaker. I am the first person. The second person would be the person to whom the speaker is speaking. So you would be the second person, or you and a group. In this class we will use y'all for you and some other people in order to differentiate it from you, and because I am from the South. Third person would be someone other than the speaker or the listener in a conversation. So if I'm speaking to little Timmy, then the third person would be used to refer to anyone else other than myself and Timmy. So he, she, it, they, if they are plural, or any noun really, whether singular or plural. So a monkey, the Pope, Batman, a pack of wolves, whatever, would all be they. They would be third person. Number, of course, refers to how many of the subject there is, whether it's singular, and therefore there's only one, or plural, meaning more than one. We don't get any more specific than that. And the tense of a verb refers to the time that the verb happens at, whether it is now, in the present, in the past, or in the future. And we'll talk about that more later. For the time being, all of our verbs happen in the present tense. Mood of a verb is something we're going to talk about much more in depth down the line. But for the time being, most of our verbs will be in the indicative mood. That is when a verb is simply stating a fact or asking a question. Or in the imperative mood when a verb is a command, like take out the trash, or clean your room, or do your homework, all of which you've probably heard in the past. The voice of a verb refers to whether it is active or passive. We won't get into that too much now, but I do want to say that at this point all verbs are active. So you don't want to translate anything in a passive sense where the subject is having the verb done to it, like the ball is kicked or the book is read, as in is being read. You don't want to translate anything like that because it's going to be wrong for the time being. Now, when we manipulate a verb in Latin and in English, we do what's called conjugating that verb. And when we conjugate a verb, we list all of the possible combinations of person and number in a particular tense, mood, and voice. And again, right now, all of our verbs are present, they are active, and they are indicative. So we're just going to be manipulating the combinations between person, listed in this column, and number here at the tops of the columns. So a verb that is first person and singular always has the subject of I, because that's the only possible first person singular subject. And likewise, first person and plural always has the subject we. Second person singular you, second person plural y'all, and so on. I didn't bother to write out he, she, and it for all of these. I'm just using he as a substitute for space purposes. And you'll notice that in English our verbs change slightly as they change in person and number, but only really this one spot right here, whoops, let's go back. There's one spot where in the third person singular we add the letter S to a verb, from I praise, you praise, he praises. So you'll note that English conjugations aren't very exciting. They generally are pretty straightforward. A better example is maybe the word to, or the verb to be, where we can see it conjugated I am, but you are, and he is. That's a pretty good example of a conjugation in English, where the verb actually undergoes some changes depending on the subject of the verb. Although you'll see that in the plural, the verb is are for every possible combination, every person, right? We are, y'all are, and they are. So that's not too terribly exciting. In Latin, however, we change the spelling of each of our verbs by adding an ending to that verb that corresponds to the appropriate person and number. And you'll see that those endings are O, S, T for first person, second person, and third person singular, and then mus, tis, and unt for the plural, first, second, and third person. You want to make sure that you memorize these endings because they're going to show up over and over and over again for the next 3 years of study of Latin. And so you want to really make sure that you know these endings. Ost, mus, tis, unt. You'll also note that the first person singular ending is occasionally an M, and I'll talk about that later when that actually shows up. For the time being, you're okay with just ost, mus, tis, and unt. You'll find all this in your book as well. You want to make sure that you look carefully at that and memorize those endings. So, what do we do with the endings? That's an important question. Well, first of all, we talk about something called the infinitive. The infinitive of a verb is a non-conjugated form of that verb. It doesn't have any of those endings, ost, mus, tis, or unt. It's not conjugated. It usually ends in re and is always the second principal part of the verb, which yesterday I should have talked about vocabulary and discussed that with you just a little bit. The infinitive of every verb translates into English as to verb. Right? So the infinitive of the verb that means love translates as to love, because that's how we translate the infinitive. The verb stem of a verb in Latin is equal to that infinitive minus the re. So if you go to the second principal part of the verb, as I said right here, second principal part of the verb, second principal part of the verb is the infinitive. If you take off the re, you're left with the verb stem. And that stem vowel, which is the last vowel in the stem, identifies a verb's conjugation. Conjugation is a family of verbs that all act the same way. So if that stem vowel is an A, then your verb is first conjugation. If your stem vowel is an E, your verb is second conjugation. They're not named with very exciting names. First and second isn't the most fun name in the world, but that's what they're called, first and second. So, when you conjugate a verb, as we're about to do with laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum, you go to that verb and you look at its principal parts. The first principal part is always the first person singular in the present indicative active. So you'll note that it ends in an O, just like that first person singular ending in ost, mus, tis, unt. So that's always the first person singular, and so it means I verb. In this case, I praise, because that's what this verb means. The second principal part, as I mentioned before, is always the infinitive, and so that always translates as to verb, in this case, to praise. You want to make sure you memorize all of the principal parts, as I mentioned before, because although we won't be using them all right away, you won't want to go back and memorize them again later for all the vocabulary you've learned up to the point where we start using, say, the third principal part. So you want to memorize this as part of your vocabulary starting now, and these principal parts will show up on quizzes and tests. All right. So the verb stem for this verb, laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum, is, as I said before, just the infinitive minus the re. If you take the re off, you're left with this verb stem, which is lauda. And as I pointed out in the previous slide, because the verb stem ends in an A, this is a first conjugation verb. More about that later. So, when we conjugate a first conjugation verb like laudo, we see it is laudo, laudas, where we're just taking that S ending and stinging it onto the end of the verb stem. Laudat, laudamus, laudatis, laudant. And they just mean I praise, you praise, he praises, we praise, y'all praise, they praise, in accordance with our person and number. A second conjugation verb, like moneo, monere, moneve, monitum. Again, we're taking our verb stem, which we got from taking the re off of the second principal part, and we're adding our verb endings, ost, mus, tis, unt. And so we end up with moneo, mones, monet, monemus, monetis, monent. The imperative is another form of the verb. As I mentioned before, this is a different mood. Right? The verbs we just conjugated were the indicative mood. This verb is the imperative mood. And the imperative is used when we want to give a command to someone. By its nature, it's always in the second person, because you're always giving a command to you or to a group of people, y'all. So it can either be second person singular or second person plural, depending on who the command is being given to. In Latin, the singular imperative is simply the verb stem. So we see lauda here again, which is just the infinitive minus the re. That's the verb stem. And then mone is that monere, which we saw in the previous slide. Drop the re. There's your singular imperative. The plural imperative, a command you're giving to more than one person, is the same verb stem as the singular imperative, right here, except we're adding the ending te. So lauda means praise if you're commanding one person to do it. Laudate means praise if you're commanding more than one person to do it. Mone and then monete, same way, right? Mone is singular, monete, plural. When translating, Latin verbs can be translated into English in different ways depending on the sentence it's in. The simplest way to translate a Latin verb is simply the subject verbs, as in laudo, which means I praise. Another way to translate it is to use is or are verbing, right? As in Bill is praising is a perfectly good translation of just Bill laudat. Right? Or you could translate it as the subject does verb, as Bill does verb. You'll do this most often when you're negating the verb, right? Because it's hard to say Bill not verb, right? But you want to say Bill does not verb, right? So you're going to supply that word does, and that's perfectly acceptable to add that English word to your sentence. Another trick of Latin is, of course, and I mentioned this earlier, I think on Thursday, that the word order in Latin is extremely flexible. So in English, of course, we go subject, verb, direct object, as in Bill eats cake. In Latin, that order would probably be something like Bill, cake, eats, but that's not a hard and fast rule. You just have to be flexible with your potential word order, following the rules, and we'll talk about that more later. Once we have nouns and things, this will all make much more sense and be easier for you. And that's the end of that. If you need to, feel free to look back and watch the video again, or of course, ask questions on Piazza and in class. I will see you tomorrow.